All right, welcome back to another episode of Contrabandum Discussions. Today, I have with me to discuss Japan and FDR and the coming of World War II, the great Josiah Lippincott. So, Josiah, thanks for joining me.
Awesome. Thank you for having me.
We're discussing elements of a dissertation that you're writing. You're over at Hillsdale and you're working on your PhD in politics or political theory. What is it?
Yeah, political science, political philosophy. Yeah, politics.
Cool. Yeah. So so FDR, I mean, he's the most popular president. Every court historian who looks back and ranks the presidents will put someone like Washington or Lincoln, in the top 3 to 5, but FDR is always up there. You are not an FDR fan, and we're going to get into that today, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the Pacific theater because a lot of people focus on what was going on in Germany and in Europe, but FDR actually had a really interesting aspect to his study that takes place on the Japanese front. So we're going to discuss that. Before we get into the details of the history, I think it's important to set the stage ideologically, because a lot of what we think about in terms of the establishment foreign policy is actually rooted back in FDR and Woodrow Wilson. But the America First phenomenon that is represented by people like Pat Buchanan and now in people like Trump and the MAGA movement are really this it's been building up for many decades, but it's long been there under the surface, sort of at the margins, but really it's pushing back against something that has been the default instinct of the establishment foreign policy, really since before World War II and FDR. So let's start there. Let's start with the ideology. Let's start with the way that FDR and others of his progressive ilk saw the function of the United States in the coming of the 20th century. So what were the ideological roots of FDR's foreign policy?
Yeah, so just to begin, as a scholar, my work is oriented toward understanding the vision of justice that animated policymakers. So it's just an account of what did they say, what did they think, and I have a view on that, which flows out of my own interpretation of that data. But I want to emphasize, my focus in my research is to articulate, like, what did they think was right. I think to begin, just ideologically, the problem with a lot of historiography relating to the Second World War, the Cold War, to American politics in general, is that it focuses too much on social forces or economics, or you're looking at a map and it's like it's like a risk map, and so you have this the consensus view avoids the articulation of what is justice, what is the purpose of government. And for the progressives, I think the striking dimension that unifies them from really the turn of the 20th century, so at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, the overwhelming consensus is in favor of moral crusading, the perfection of mankind, that the old problem of tyranny has been done away with. We have new challenges in economics and in the life of the world that have elevated our knowledge, and the movement of history has drawn us to a point where we need to make, we have to get out of the old sort of nationalist or even parochial understandings of the world. We're going to have global uplift. We're going to have the advancement of civilization across the world. And so I think you see that animating moral impulse in a lot of the progressive thinkers. It's one of the defining aspects of their thought. And you see that in Woodrow Wilson and FDR, especially in relation to the world wars. And so that's where I focus my energy.
I think I like the word messianic. I think that's really the word that comes to mind when we try to understand their foreign policy. Is they saw America as playing this eschatological function in the perfecting of the world. And America to them was not about the preservation of the American people and the tranquility of its own political order, but it saw itself as needing and having the moral burden to apply American achievements across the entire world. And that really culminates in FDR, but its roots go back to Woodrow Wilson. I mean, would you say that FDR is standing on the shoulders of Wilson, or do you see any, distinction between the two?
Well, he definitely frames himself in terms of Wilson's project. And so one of the things I do in my written work and my scholarly research is show that even at when he was working as Assistant Secretary of the Navy during the First World War, and as he gives a speech in 1919, at the Worcester Polytechnic Institute, where he talks about his vision of justice. And his argument is that all of the wartime emergency measures in the First World War need to be continued into peacetime. So for FDR, and this is another dimension of progressive thought, is their complete moral certainty. So not only do they have this messianic vision, which they do, they bring in Christianity, and that's part of it. God wants us to save the world and to uplift mankind. But they also unify it with technical or scientific knowledge. So, the progress of history has gotten us to this point where we now understand things in a deeper, more comprehensive way. And so part of that then becomes a justification for the rule of experts. There's wisdom, right? We understand that there's crises that need to be resolved. That's FDR's position. Ordinary politics, this gross populist energy. What we really need is to have this directed by those who see the real crises in American life and can treat them as the emergencies they are. So the justification then for the progressives and for FDR in particular, and in the speech he delivers in 1919, is we need these emergency powers in wartime to continue into peacetime, because all of the crises in American life are like wars, and they demand the same kind of engagement, the same kind of use of emergency and expansive power. So yes, you're absolutely right. This messianic vision animates the progressives, and it's welded then to a vision of technocratic or expert-led government, not just in America but around the world. And you'll begin to see that in the 1930s, especially.
The old early 19th century vision of American foreign policy was really quite non-interventionist. They saw themselves as needing to focus on the preservation of the American continent and the needs of the American people as it was. FDR, he really pushed back hard and dunked on anyone who had adopted that older view, that Washingtonian, we're not going to commit and be engaged in long-term entanglements. All of that was very well established in the late 18th century and early to mid 19th century. FDR had no patience for that, did he? And people that would represent, today's, paleo-conservative or more restrained foreign policy, FDR was very much against those people just as much as or more than the Bush administration would have been. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yeah. FDR all but calls these people fascists in his 1944 State of the Union address, and he attacks them repeatedly. The 1919 address that I just mentioned, and then when he ran for vice president in 1920, FDR he gives a long speech about foreign policy where he articulates this vision. There are people, they want to build a Chinese wall around America, is what he says. And he attacks these. He says, well, what they want to do is give up. So this dichotomy gets presented. If you don't want to intervene around the world to secure peace and prosperity, then what you want to do is, then what those people want is to get rid of all of our foreign trade. They want an end to all of our ability to make money. They want to flee from aggression and violence and war. They're basically ostriches who want to put their head in the sand. And so and I think that account, however, as you've indicated, is not an honest accounting of the early American view of foreign policy. So when you look at the founding consensus, and I use the Declaration of Independence as the best articulation of what the founders thought, you see a much different view, which is that the founders hold that nations of the earth are equal in respect to one another. The Declaration says we have a separate and equal station of the nations upon the earth. And what that means in practice is these different nations are sovereign in their own right. They have the ability to form their own types of regimes, to make their own decisions, especially and crucially the decision to go to war. That's something unilateral. It's crucial to the understanding of sovereignty. So in the founders list the powers that states have in the Declaration in order to articulate the powers America is now taking on as an independent nation. They list the ability to make trade policy, decide to go to war, to make peace, to create treaties. These are all powers that the Declaration identifies as parts of sovereignty. So when the founders, in their view, their non-intervention, quote unquote, is always directed to the preservation of American rights, because the goal of the American government is to protect the person and property, or the life and liberty, and the happiness, therefore, of the American people. So when American soldiers die in combat, even justified combat, obviously that's not good, right? That they're being asked to sacrifice for the sake of some good, which is the preservation of our regime itself, to protect life and liberty. So, but it's a weighty thing, because if you send men to die, obviously their right to life is being challenged in some way. So that of course is part of forming a coherent political regime. Is you're going to have to sacrifice to preserve the thing you want, but it's a weighty thing. You can't just spend blood and treasure on foreign crusading and fixing the world. That's not the purpose of government as the founders identify it. For them, it's rooted in the preservation of person and property, and you need the consent of the governed. It's a choice. So it's not simply technocratic rule. People need to consent, and that's the foundational element that they identify there, protection and consent, these two lodestars of their thought.
Yeah, what you said there provides a crucial bridge, I think, to getting into the history. So the American founders recognized that other states were sovereign over their own, national interests and all of that. But FDR didn't necessarily think that. And I think that the whole Japanese and Chinese tension really kind of exemplifies what you're saying here. So talk about the fact that the FDR administration, maybe others working within his cabinet, they did not see the Japanese national interest and sovereignty as a legitimate claim at all. And they justified their own involvement in the East on that basis. So maybe talk about how they interpreted Japan, and then also how their own moralizing messianic foreign policy played into that.
That's a great, and just to condense that discussion. So it might be helpful to understand how I got to this topic. So as a Marine, I was deployed to Okinawa for 7 months in 2019. While I was there, of course, the question becomes, how did we get here? And there's a standard narrative. Okay, Pearl Harbor happens on December 7th, 1941. We are attacked out of nowhere. We weren't doing anything. And now we need to go to war in order to defend ourselves from this foreign threat. Well, then you ask the question, how did the embargo, how did the Pearl Harbor attack happen? Well, if you're educated or know something about the war, you know about the oil embargo that was placed on the Japanese by FDR. We were refusing to sell them oil. We froze their assets. We also wouldn't sell them certain kinds of raw materials. And then the question becomes, well, wait a second, why did that embargo go in place on the Japanese in the summer of 1941? Well, the ultimate cause is there's a moral objection by FDR, and especially by his Secretary of War, by Henry Stimson, against the Japanese invasion of China. So it's a concern. Well, they're aggressing against this foreign country, and so what you see then is America needs to intervene to prevent this horrible aggression from taking place abroad. And so there's a lot of things going on behind the scenes. The elements of the American government work to prevent the Japanese from being able to buy oil, even from non-American powers like the Dutch. And this puts the Japanese, in their view, in an existential position. They feel that their sovereignty is threatened. But in the FDR progressive mindset, Japan doesn't have the right to be sovereign because she's aggressing. What the Japanese are doing is immoral. And so, and I emphasize this in my research, the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which, if you've gone through like an AP US history course, members of your audience, that's typically framed as this treaty outlawing war. And it's presented as something ridiculous. How could you outlaw war? That's crazy. But in the progressive mind, the whole point of doing that is to say what Japan is doing is illegal. They're violating this law that they signed on to, and now the United States is going to enforce it. But by doing this, you've now gotten this question of, well, who judges this law, this treaty? Well, it's not clear from the treaty itself. And so if you extrapolate this logic, now America is the defender of the peace everywhere on earth. We need to be involved everywhere. It's like that MLK quote, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Well, the logical continuation is we need to wage war against every single criminal or aggressor all over the earth. And so that logic for the progressives is present in FDR's interest in China. They do not, and FDR at no point, in his administration, at no point do they ever make national defense a priority for justifying American involvement with China. There's no claim like the Japanese are going to seize Manchuria and then build a fleet and land here in America. That argument is never made in a coherent way in public. It's always the peace of the world is threatened and America's in the world, and therefore if aggressors take power, then they'll threaten us somehow down the line. And I think that itself is a very questionable chain of logic. Is it really the case that we can't have justice in America if there's injustice abroad? So again, that goes to my personal view in political judgment. But the thing I want to emphasize is that for FDR and for the progressives in his administration, what they wanted was a New Deal, not only for America, but for the world. In the Atlantic Charter of 1941, which FDR signed, indicates he talks about securing the world from fear and want. He talks about social security for the world. That's an expansive and I would argue imperialist vision. And you can't understand progressive military decisions without reference to their understanding of morality and justice. And that's the crucial point.
We're going to get, maybe when we get to the 30s and 40s, we'll get a little bit to, the communist relationships with the FDR administration. But like, let's step back to the Hoover administration, because Henry Stimson was in the Hoover administration. Is that right?
Yes, as Secretary of State.
Yeah. So he was already there working in the war. Was he in the War Department at that time?
No, that was under FDR. But Stimson,
Okay.
It gets confusing because Stimson had such a long career and did so much.
Yeah. Well, what I'm curious about for him is whether he had purely ideological motivations like FDR did, or whether he was representing some other economic or some other power broker, or if he too was part of this ideological messianic impulse in the early 20th century.
Yeah, I would say for Stimson, in my read of the man, reading his autobiography and then reading his just his book, and he wrote one called The Far Eastern Crisis, which is actually, I think, the best thing on American policy toward Japan in the 1930s. And so there's a tendency, especially among socialist scholars, they want to see everything as the movement of capitalism. And then it kind of, William Appleman Williams in the Wisconsin school, this is his kind of big revisionist take, is that, the movement, it's all free trade imperialism, which I actually think is a contradiction in terms and clouds what's really going on here. That the progressives would talk about, and Stimson does in his book, they talk about the economic possibilities in China, right? They talk about the expansion of markets. They do talk about quote unquote free trade and the desire to have the ability to sell American goods abroad. This is especially clear in the in justifications for the American occupation of the Philippines. If you go back to the very beginning of the 20th century, there's definitely a push for, well, the Philippines will open up this market. But when you look at China, one of the decisive aspects, and I consider this decisive aspects of Stimson's work as Secretary of State, who dealt with the Mukden crisis in 1931 when the Japanese invaded what is now Manchuria in China. And there's this big question of the justification for the Japanese invasion. They already had troops there. It's complicated. But the key point is, in Stimson's interpretation of this event, is that the Japanese are the aggressors, and that also that China is being, we need to bring them into the civilized world, and that means we need to protect them because China will be this great power of the future. There's 400 million souls there. And so if they're aggressed against, then deep in the future, they'll become a threat to the world. And so we need to have this peaceful and bringing of China into the world order, and we need to protect them then. And so that moralistic dimension is always there. And I think it's the primary driver of progressive foreign policy in Stimson and in Wilson and McKinley and all of the Americans who were involved in that time period.
Yeah, the Manchurian situation is interesting because they obviously blame Japan for invading or for being the initiation of aggression, or however you want to say it. But from a more objective or maybe a realist standpoint, Japan and China were both pursuing their national self-interests. So why do you think FDR and others would blame Japan, and why wouldn't they blame China if both of them were active on the scene at the time, pursuing their own self-interest? Why would they put the blame on Japan for this?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Well, I think some of it is just a preference for the Chinese. One of the things Stimson mentions in his book on the Far Eastern Crisis, so he was educated at both Harvard and Yale at the end of the 19th century. He was born in 1867, so he's right there at the beginning of the progressive era. So there were Chinese students who came to the United States to be educated in American universities, and Stimson happened to know them and like them. And so that was part of it. There was a China fad that was very powerful in American life. Excuse me. Woodrow Wilson, one of his advisors on Chinese policy, or several of them, were like interested in Buddhism and were also Christian missionaries. So those individuals had a lot of influence on policy, especially Christian missionaries, because the Chinese are considered this great, untapped missionary field. We need to go bring them to Jesus. And so you have these people and they go, well, they then have a sympathy, the political interest in China that they then bring into their advice when they advise on policy. So when you have traders who are going over to China to make money, oftentimes people who know Chinese are missionaries and they have a religious and moral impulse that goes beyond just trying to make money. The Americans were trading with China from the very beginning of the Republic, but you did not see a concern with the Chinese and uplift until late in the 19th century. That's an interesting. Before it's like, well, I'm just going to make money selling stuff and buying stuff, But then there's this switch over to now we're going to save their soul, and that gets very political and it's militaristic. Because when you're saving souls and you're doing the will of God, I mean, what's off the table? These people who are aggressors are destroying, the possibility of faith. I mean, this is a powerful argument. But as for Japan, I mean, one of the interesting things there is there was a lot of sympathy for Japan in the United States. They were our ally during World War I. All the cherry trees on the National Mall, famously, are gifts of the Japanese government to the American people. So there was a sense that the Japanese were, support for the Japanese. But I think there was also, the Japanese industrialized more quickly. They were a sovereign power in their own right in a way that it made it easier then to condemn them. Or to fear them as well, kind of mixture. And so there was, for a variety of accidental historical circumstances, a lot more sympathy for the Chinese than the Japanese. And, but it could have easily, I guess the point is it could have gone the other way. I mean, the Japanese arguments for getting involved in Manchuria were, well, we oppose communism, the Qing dynasty has collapsed, there's all these warlords, we're protecting Japanese citizens. And by the way, when the Japanese legate to the League of Nations, when he describes the reasons for the 1931 military actions in Manchuria, he then cites American intervention in Latin America as a justification for Japanese intervention. So the Japanese very much had an argument under existing international law that they made, and you could argue whether or not it was right or wrong, but the point is that, for, the reasons I think I'm describing here, especially missionary sympathy, the Chinese, and the size. China is going to be this great power of the future. They're weak, but we can uplift them. That progressive longing to, we're going to help out. We're going to lend a helping hand. The Japanese don't need as much of a helping hand, but the Chinese do. And so that means they're more moral. We need to uplift them. They're the priority. So I think the confluence of all of those reasons justifies, or at least in the progressive mind, the preference for China over Japan.
One of the points that you've made before is that whereas most people look at like Pearl Harbor and FDR's reaction to Japan in the 1930s as something that almost came kind of randomly and maybe in the course of what was going on in Germany, but you make the point that because of its approach, even back to the 1919 address at Worcester, he basically is approaching Japan in this way that almost makes a clash with them inevitable long before the European crisis comes onto the scene. So maybe engage with that a little bit. And why was Pearl Harbor not this thing out of the blue, but something that was almost the culmination of a decade of foreign policy?
Well, what I emphasize in my scholarly work is that war is the product of choice. And I hate this language when people say we had to go to war, as if it's a necessity. Ice has to melt at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, right? It melts. Okay, that is not the way that war is. Human choice is not that way. It isn't like this amount of pressure, this ratio inside of an engine, if you light that fuel on fire with that air mixture, it does this thing. That's not the way human life works. And it's a matter of choice. So why did we make the choices we did? Well, I want to emphasize this moral view. The actors who were in charge had a view that allowed them to interpret the phenomena of the world in a way that led to certain outcomes or made them far more likely. So for FDR, the invasion of China, in his view, was immoral, right? And so the United States needed to intervene on the side of the Chinese, needed to keep, the rape of Nanking from happening, this brutal violence, and we are involved. How can you stand by while there's horrific aggression happening? And Stimson, for instance, uses this language of war as this maelstrom, this firestorm will engulf the world. So if you let the cancer of aggression spread, then we're all going to die. It's going to destroy the world. And so FDR, I think, it participates in that kind of eschatological or apocalyptic vision, and we then need to intervene. We have a moral duty to not stand by. And so that framing then makes intervention and war much more likely. So FDR did not have to embargo Japanese oil companies. American oil companies wanted to sell oil to the Japanese government, and they didn't really care that it was going to be used in part to fund the Japanese war machine. It's like, not our circus, not our monkeys. We're here just to make money. And so not, what do you care if you're, an American oil producer? It's not, and again, that's kind of the founder's position. Countries decide to go to war. How are you to decide between them? If they're both sovereign, what position do we have then to judge them? Who's the supreme judge of the world? Do we speak for God? Amer Vattel, an old international law theorist from the 18th century, has this great passage on the dangers of setting yourself up as the voice of God on earth. And so the progressive view, by contrast, says, no, we know the will of God and we're going to enforce it on a planetary scale. And so I think, and FDR indicated all through the 1930s, famously in the quarantine address delivered in, I think it's 1938, he's saying there, okay, these powers, we need to quarantine them. It's almost like a COVID lockdown, that kind of language. We need to seal you off, these aggressors, from the rest of the world for the sake of peace. And that means, it's a promise. We're going to get involved and we're going to do these things. And you see that also with Germany as well. The United States was basically in a shooting war with Nazi Germany in the fall of 1941, before there was any declaration of war, based in the North Atlantic, based off of our policy there. And by the way, in the Atlantic Charter in August of 1941, FDR is there stating, essentially, well, we look forward to the destruction of Nazi tyranny and the destruction of the Axis more broadly. So, okay, you're already framing yourself as a combatant and talking about how great Stalin is for fighting the Nazis and how much you start giving money and weapons to the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941. So already you see the progressive moralism. When they see the phenomena of international life, they already have a view of what they want to do, the world order they want to create. And they have a view of the actions they want to take. They want to get involved. That is a moral driving fact there. They're not trying to stay out, and they're not taking choices that would avert war. They want to get involved. That's the key point.
Yeah, so there's this 1940 to 1941 oil embargo, and you make the case that there's a relationship between that and what happened at Pearl Harbor. But what was the motivation for the oil embargo? Was it purely the ideology, or were they trying to engage in protecting and securing resources in China? What was going on with that? And then maybe how did it kind of culminate in Pearl Harbor?
It's moral. It's all moral. The focus is the Japanese have invaded. They're aggressors. We don't want to fund the Japanese war machine. We got to stop them. I mean, it's not economic. By the way, it is a key point. It was not economically beneficial for the United States. But it'd be more specific. Oil companies want to sell oil. They can't do it. Okay, the Japanese are offering gold for oil. The oil companies want gold. They can't get it because the American government. So just on the surface, whatever you want to say about that, that is not economically beneficial. You are worse off by imposing that kind of embargo. So the only way, the economic arguments then end up being really abstruse. The idea being, well, okay, so why can't you have trade relations with Japan? If the Japanese seize those resources, they could sell them. So why does it matter from whom are you buying it? Why does that matter? Right? Like, it could be the Japanese or the Chinese. So again, the arguments are not really economic, or when they are, they're always rooted in a profound misunderstanding of how economics works. But again, and that's all secondary though. The primary driver is the defense against aggression.
I'm fascinated by the fact that arguably at that time, the Soviet Union was probably more morally egregious. And yet FDR treated them with a relative leniency. And so he's pushing this moralizing agenda on Japan, and yet he doesn't really do that with the Soviet Union. In fact, his administration is chock full of their representatives and agents. Can you explain that? Was FDR aware of the hypocrisy here? Maybe engage with that whole phenomenon?
Yes, kind of. So the Soviet Union was a pariah state from 1917. From however you want to describe the rise of the Soviet state. Basically, once they become sovereign, there's massive opposition in the West because they kill a bunch of people. The Soviets steal a bunch of property. American investments are just, the American investors lose a bunch of money in this, in the communist revolution. Obviously, the Soviets want to overthrow the world. I mean, they're not going to respect property rights. But by FDR's administration, he wanted to have peaceful relations with the Soviet Union. He wanted to recognize them as an official power. He did so, and without really extracting many concessions from the Soviets, including, reimbursing or investors for their losses. So FDR was definitely soft on the Soviets, and I think you see, and I talk about his speech at the American Youth Congress in early 1941. One of the things that he emphasizes, excuse me, this speech is in 40. The speech he delivers in the beginning of 1940. And the reason that detail is important is because FDR. So the Soviets invade Poland in September of 1939, which everyone is told is the worst thing ever. Hitler invades Poland. That's super bad. Well, the Soviets are there, right? Part of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the secret protocol, is the Soviets get part of Poland. Well, in the winter of 1939, they also invade Finland, which FDR does condemn. He does say that's bad. Well, a bunch of communists get mad at him, and a bunch of them come to the, as part of his youth organization, come to the White House, and they're booing FDR Soviets for invading for invading Finland. And FDR tries to defend himself there, and he makes many of the arguments he would make against the Japanese, though I would note not as forcefully. He does say, well, aggression is bad, and the Soviets are engaged in aggression, and we condemn that. But his real focus is not the evils of the Soviets, but the Japanese and the Germans. And as you point out, it didn't have to be that way. I mean, really, if you want to talk about, Stalin through the purges killed more Jews in the Soviet Union than Hitler did prior to 1941. So, I mean, this is a massive, millions of people starving, famine, imprisoned, gulags. Also, Stalin invaded by 1941. He'd invaded the same number of countries. So, but why? And I think the deeper root is that the progressives saw in the socialists and in the communists ideological fellow travelers. And the main critique is that they're just too radical. Their heart's in the right place, but they go too far. And that's the FDR take. Well, they don't respect freedom of religion, but one day they will, because the Spirit of God will come and reveal itself. Kind of that kind of language, like they'll come back to God. There's no sympathy of that kind expressed in relation to Nazi Germany or Japan. They're just evil. They got to be quarantined. And the Soviets is kind of, well, what they did was mean, and we shouldn't have that. But when they get attacked by Hitler, then they're good, right? Then we were on their side. We were more sympathetic even beforehand. And that's, I think, that's a fly in the ointment of the whole anti-aggression narrative. If World War II was fought to end tyranny, how do you explain giving tons of money and weapons to the Soviets? We need to save Europe from dictators. Okay, half of it's left in control. We're going to save Poland. Okay, Poland was occupied effectively by the Soviet Union for another 50 years after the war. That seems, whoa, that's a problem. It's a big problem. And it's one I think mainstream scholarship does not try and engage with in a serious way.
Yeah, it's really hard to tell. I mean, just, I haven't dug into it as much as you have, but it's really fascinating because I've also adopted this ideological interpretation of what was going on in pre-World War to United States and Europe. But one of the things that just it's difficult to come into terms with is the fact that the U.S. had such a comfortable and cozy relationship with Stalin, and they knew at the time. And the American people were kept from it, but the U.S. administration understood what the Soviets were up to, what their agenda was in Europe, and things of that nature. It was completely against all the things that they promised they were for: democracy and equal rights and national self-sovereignty. I mean, the Soviets embodied the repudiation of that entire ethos. And yet the FDR administration worked hand in hand with them in a much more comfortable way, even that maybe with Britain. So it's fascinating to me, either this hypocrisy or this mass oversight, or perhaps even an infiltration that may be a better argument to explain what was going on. So I want to pause on that real quick before we move on. But do you think that there is a case to be made for the FDR administration being completely infiltrated with communists, and that explains, some of the dynamics with the United States and the Soviet Union?
Yeah, they were absolutely tons of Soviet agents and fellow travelers and communists were in the FDR administration. So it's hard to actually say it's an infiltration. I think at the time, and then especially in the 1920s and 30s, the American left was ascendant, and the progressives and the communists had a lot in common. They're not identical. The progressives were not doctrinaire Marxists in that way, but the Marxist argument made in the Communist Manifesto has the elements there are very similar to the progressive view. It's not as radical in the progressive view, but the idea big business is this threat to the world, we need to mitigate this. I mean, what Soviets meant by mitigation in their view of history was we got to shoot all the bourgeoisie and we're going to seize their land. Whereas the progressives, well, it needs to be managed. So, but there's a lot of overlap. And so in the FDR administration, like Harry Dexter White, who was the assistant secretary of the Treasury, was like an outright Soviet agent who worked to help them. I mean, there's tons of stories you can tell about White, but basically the foundation of the post-war monetary order, he ensured that the Soviets, they printed a new mark in Germany as currency in the post-war period. Harry Dexter White made sure that the plates for the creation of that money, those marks, were given to the Soviets. So the Soviets engaged immediately in mass counterfeiting and monetary inflation, which then allowed them to steal productive resources from the West German quote unquote capitalist side. So that's an element in which, and it was like, is that infiltration or is that just, again, the Soviets were our allies? I mean, FDR is, praising Stalin. I mean, the United States made pro-Soviet propaganda. If you go watch the old Why We Fight series, there's a portion there on the Soviets. I mean, so is it infiltration or is it just outright sympathy? I mean, I think it's really a mixture of both, and it's so endemic in the FDR administration, you really wonder, man, it's powerful. Now, of course, there were anti-communist elements as well, but again, FDR sidelined them, and it really wasn't until his death that those elements then came back and were able to assert themselves. And, you see, then the Cold War breaks out. And that's a complicated thing, and we can get into it, but it's a part of the legacy of the war.
Let's talk about the idea of unconditional surrender, right? This was the policy that the Allies basically, had for the entire Axis, bloc, but especially Japan is the one we most remember it for. But how does unconditional surrender highlight the ideological underpinnings of what the United States wanted done in Asia?
Yes, well, that's a crucially important question, and I think thinking about war really clarifies politics, and it clarifies ideology in a way that blood that really gets the mind aligned, with what's happening in the world. So when we talk about unconditional surrender, it's a break from, and FDR did not present it this way, but it was a break. It was a break from the older understanding of war, which is that when you fight a war, the goal is peace. And the Declaration of Independence actually says this in regards to the British, that when we will hold them as we hold the rest of the mankind, in peace, in enemies, in war enemies, in peace friends. The idea being we will be friends with the British after the war is won and we've secured our independence. The idea being they're a sovereign equal, and though we have a conflict, that conflict will end in a peace treaty. That peace treaty will involve amnesty, a forgetting of crimes and all the injuries of the war in order to have true peace. Because if you leave the causes of war undone and you prosecute them, then the war continues. War is just any kind of use of violence against an opponent for the sake of achieving some political end. And so the older, and I call this system, and in line with the scholars, the Westphalian order, from basically the 17th century through the beginning of the 20th century, World War I. By World War II, it's definitely over. But in that older system where everyone's an equal, war is more akin to a duel. And when a war is like a duel, then the violence is bracketed by certain consensus views as to what violence entails. So the law of war then is adopted by everyone because there's a harmony of interests to bracket and limit violence. We're going to have POWs from our own men. We want them treated well, so we'll treat another sovereign nation's POWs well. Well, that view is demoralized, right? The view is war informed. I mean, if they fly in a flag, they wear uniforms, they're an acknowledged sovereign state, then they're under the law of war. They have to respect it, and we have to respect them. When you have that view, it's not a total war situation. You're not saying these people are the epitome of evil. They need to be wiped from the surface of the earth. You're saying we need to fight them for specific concrete goals. When the war is over, we're going to go back and have peace. Well, by the progressive era, once they remoralize war. It's like, well, and the argument against the old system is, and this is an argument Stimson makes explicitly in 1935, is war is murder. And the old system that tolerates sovereign states unilaterally going to war, tolerates murder and aggression and theft. That's wrong. We oppose that. We need a new order. Well, when you remoralize war, now it's not between two enemies who both combatants can claim justice and are treated as if they're just without looking at their actual cause. We're just going to treat them as if they're just. But now one side is a criminal. We can do whatever we want to them. And I think that moral switch allows then for the use of atomic weapons. It allows for the use of concentration camps in the United States for Japanese citizens, even Americans of Japanese descent. And then you see also the war crimes trial. That itself is an innovation in international law, or really international relations, that then I would argue the war doesn't really end until the executions of the top Japanese leaders. So really the last battle is like the day before Christmas Eve in 1948. The real end of the war is when you finally finish killing enemy combatants, quote unquote. And that was the part of that trial. And so now war is unbracketed and it's unbounded. It lacks those boundaries. And that's a real problem for ourselves. It means that the old distinction between civilian and combatant has gone away, and with horrific consequences.
I know as a scholar, you're trying to present these arguments in a way that doesn't, take a side on it, but really explains and, shows the connections. But so with that said, I think you're drawing a connection between the unconditional surrender model and then what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because that's sort of a logical implication of this ideological framework that if people don't, if they don't transform their own states and their own systems in accordance with the moral order, which is what the United States, supposedly represents at the time, then anything can be justified, including atomic bombing. So maybe interact with that as sort of a culmination or a fruit of unconditional surrender.
Yeah. So, I mean, my scholarly work is to establish how could they drop the bomb? The technical question, like, again, a lot of times when people talk about the World War, they like to talk about the weapon systems and like, oh, the tank, and then this, the Sherman versus the T-34 and this rifle and the Sturmgewehr the Germans invented and the ME-262, blah, blah, blah. And what I want to talk about is what ideology drove the use of those weapons, because the human questions are always way more important than the economic and military science questions. It frames everything you do. So how did you get to the point? How did the American government get to the point of being willing and able to bomb civilians directly? Well, by saying they're not civilians. They're combatants. There were drill presses there in Tokyo. They're being used to make weapons. Therefore, we can firebomb the whole city. We're killing. They're not civilians, women and children. They're war workers. And then the collateral damage is justified because, well, war is war, and sometimes you got to, break a few eggs to make an omelet. And what I want to emphasize in my writing is you don't have to do that. And I don't get into it a lot in the dissertation, but also it's not obvious at all that mode of warfare contributes to attaining your political goals. In fact, it's inimical. Killing a bunch of Japanese people did not make the Japanese surrender that much faster. I mean, there's a powerful argument made by Paul Hamm and other scholars that the invasion of Japanese possessions in mainland China was more influential in a decision to surrender than the atomic bombings. I mean, like 6 Japanese cities have been firebombed by, August of 1945. It wasn't really clear. They didn't have photo evidence. The emperor never saw photo evidence of the atomic bombing. So, and it happens, very closely related to the invasion of Manchuria by the Soviets.
Well, and another thing on that too is one of the conditions was that the emperor would, basically abdicate, right? That he would no longer. And then after the bombs, he didn't abdicate anyways, and everything was fine. And it just it kind of like tears the veil off of the threats that the United States was making, that the world was on the edge of peril if Japan didn't, completely change itself and come into conformity with the American system and American Western, norms, institutional norms, and it kind of it undermines the claims that the Allies were making at the time, that if any country existed which had these older ways of doing things, these older models, then the world was necessarily in a state of tension and potential chaos. And I think that's kind of one of the lessons of the bombings, is that it actually called the bluff on the United States. And in many ways, you know, from my perspective, and I don't want to throw this back on you, but from my perspective, it put the moral burden back on the Allies. But let me transition from that over to the coming of the new world order. You've described the Pacific theater as a specific marker on the way to the new world order. Like we think today, the coming of the new world order, we cite George Bush in 1990s about this new world order, but actually the 20th century itself was a replacement in many ways of Western civilization and the order that came before that. So in what ways, why specifically the case of Japan and the Pacific War was so profound that the new world order was actually built on America's treatment of Japan?
Yeah, the obvious kind of clear answer, and this is that that's where the war began for us. Pearl Harbor is the official in the consciousness as the beginning of the shooting war as such. It's in the East, right? And today when we talk about the world order, the big talk is about China. Some about Russia, but that's pretty side. You know, the big thing is China. That's, you know, Graham Allison, the Thucydides trap. We need to avoid the rising power of China. And so when you, and especially with Trump, and I will say this, MAGA, you know, different political movements it's kind of interesting how this sifting works out. Different foreign policy factions align themselves with political movements in order to shift American foreign policy. So for instance, the Bush administration, the neocons were very interested in the Middle East. So certain Sunni powers were very interested in aligning themselves with the Bush administration, and the factions in American life that thought the Middle East was the most important part of the world are then going to align themselves with George Bush social conservatism in that way. It's a kind of weird pairing. You have Zionists and the Israeli government, and then, you know, the Saudis and other powers there. And then under Biden, you see there's a shift toward the NATO Atlanticist orientation, and you can see that in the intervention in Ukraine, and he pulls out of Afghanistan. So then you see that faction loses strength there. Well, with the MAGA movement and Trump's return to power, you see a movement, a rise in the China hawks. And so again, what I want to show is the East and our framing of our relationship with China, the relationship of the American empire or the American led world order begins in the Far East. To go back even further than the war itself, the first colony that the United States possesses is the Philippines, and that plays, and it's a role we haven't really discussed. Weren't able to discuss at length here. Our possession of the Philippines played a huge role in our relationship with Japan, because now you have this American military base right off of Japan's coast that's in between them and Indonesia, where the oil is. So again, our expansion in the East is driving this. It's the test bed for progressive ideas is in the East. The first is funny. The first time American government gets involved in home mortgages, lending on home mortgages, is in the Philippines. The first American federal drug regulation is not in the United States. It's in the Philippines. It's our interest in China. And these things now, like the DEA, the FDA, these aspects of American life that are very important to our understanding of the republic and the administrative state, these things were pioneered and developed in America, in the American colonies in the Philippines, and in our relationship with China. And so from the war itself, and this is how we get into the Second World War, and it is in the East, for all of these reasons, that's a central aspect of the rise of the world order. And also, American wars since World War II have been overwhelmingly in Asia, right? Vietnam, Korea, Afghanistan, Iraq. There's just a focus on the Asian landmass and in the Far East in particular that simply cannot be avoided in a concrete and coherent understanding of the birth of the American-led New World Order.
One of the fascinating things about today is that, those of us who consider ourselves America first, and we have more of a paleo-conservative realist foreign policy, is that we consider the age of idealism, Wilsonian idealism, to have failed in its objectives. And yet, like, you look at people like, what's his name? Bill Kristol, people like him, they consider they don't speak in terms of their own failures. They speak in terms of, Trump, destroyed what was basically a century of progress. Do you think that if you ask like a Wilson or an FDR or someone like that to look back on the 20th century from our vantage point, do you think that they would have considered the 20th century a success or a failure in how they saw the world?
Oh, I think they would have considered it a success. I mean, I think that's right. I think someone like Crystal, I think the whole American establishment, neoconservative and neoliberal alike, this is all a big win. We're the world's greatest superpower. We had to do everything we did. So everything flowed into it. Yeah, I mean, well, we had to defeat German authoritarianism in the 19 teens. Well, then we had to fight the Great Depression, which just happened out of nowhere. And then we had to fight, the Japanese expansion. Then we had to fight Hitler. And then we had to fight the Soviets who were, well, we were their ally, but now they're bad and we need to fight them now. And then as soon as the Soviets are gone, it's like, well, we need to go into Iraq and defeat Saddam Hussein because he's engaged in aggression against Kuwait. And as soon as that's done, we need to get involved in the Balkans because there's genocide there. And then we need to get involved in and then 9/11 happened. So Islamofascism, now we need to fight that. And all of this is necessary, right? As soon as, Islamofascism is defeated or that's over, then you get COVID. We need to fight the upper respiratory virus. And then, now we're out of Afghanistan. And 6 months later, we're in Ukraine and monkeying with that. And then as soon as Ukraine is done, well, now we got to go monkey with Venezuela and Iran. And the point is, I think the Wilsonians and the progressive view, the internationalist view, is all of this was necessary. All of it is good. Now there's fighting in between. Some people are going to be big mad at Trump over whatever he does, and then there'll be neocons. They think, well, it's like the Democrats. The Iraq war is crazy, but Libya invading Libya or bombing Libya under Obama was awesome. Well, it all depends on where's the election cycle and which party you're part of. But the overarching consensus narrative is America has to intervene. We need to preserve the world order. If we don't do this, then there'll be complete collapse. And this is probably obvious. I don't agree with this narrative at all. I am completely opposed. I think, as I frame it in some of my popular writings, it is the economy which sustains the empire, not the other way around. American prosperity is what allows the American military and the interventionist DC establishment to wild out on a planetary scale. We do not benefit. This is kind of obvious if you just think in terms of like, where does all the money come from to do this? From the American taxpayer, from our labor. Wait a second. How is this good for me, for you to take my money? Am I getting what I paid for? Well, it's funny. Japan never had a 9/11. Well, that's kind of interesting. And they have a lot more peace. When you're in Japan, they don't have the same security procedures. Wait a second. Wait, you can have a prosperous first world country and not have to worry about Islamic terrorism. How'd that work? I mean, are we really attaining our end with the money that we're spending? But yeah, to go back to your question, I think the progressives, if they could see their handiwork, they would say this is all awesome. But of course, the project is never finished, and we need to continue the crusade until utopia, until heaven on earth is achieved.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the characteristics of ideology. And ideological foreign policy is that you're so blinded by it, you can't even step back and see the failures. You can't interpret them as failures. They're kind of like just natural stepping stones on the way up toward heaven on earth. And that's basically the language of post-millennial 19th century, eschatological progressivism. And that was infused into the Wilsonian and FDR outlook. And really it was inherited also by the neoconservatives. A lot of people don't get that. The way that the discussion is framed today is that neoconservatives are a type of conservatism. Maybe they're more lenient on gay marriage, or they've rejected some of the narratives from the South or something like that. But really, they should be seen as the inheritors of the progressive vision of the world and America's place in it. So stepping on from that, do you think that the state of the America First anti-idealism foreign policy is in a healthier place today in the 21st century, or do you think it was healthier maybe back with Robert Taft and some of the earlier old right realists of the 20th century?
Well, I'll say this about the old right realists: they failed. Right, the America First movement did not succeed. That we went to war, and part of that was they were so focused on Germany they didn't think about Japan. So I mean, guys like Charles Lindbergh, as soon as the war Pearl Harbor happened, he basically abandons all of his positions. And there's like a handful of what would now be considered cranks are the only ones who are like, nah, this was all bad. And I will say this, the libertarians, and I think actually Rothbard more than von Mises, they were really the only faction in American life that held to the old right consensus more or less. And Rothbard is critical of American involvement in World War II. Mises is not so good on this, and that's a kind of interesting point in its own right, and worth noting. But so now, so what do we have now? Well, I'd say partly what's happened is the idealistic project of moral crusading on a planetary scale has not gone well from the perspective of other people. Like, if you're a progressive like leader and moral crusader, it's like everything's awesome. Like, we like saved women in Afghanistan, and we're going to defeat Putin, and that's awesome. Well, there's other people who are like, I'm paying for all of this, or I have had friends who went and died in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it's like, what did we get for all that? So I think what you've seen, and this is interesting among a lot of veterans, is a real disillusionment with the American, foreign policy establishment and our war powers. And that's important because you have young, talented men who are interested in politics and they're going to run for office. Okay, this view is shifting. And I think Trump manifests that there's just been kind of like all the amount of demoralization and these crises that keep happening are themselves delegitimizing the consensus order. There's like these two powers. On the one side, you have the productive power of the American people, which makes life better. People are happier and they buy bigger houses and nicer cars. And then you've got this parasitic crusading element, which is drawing down on that wealth to launch these projects abroad. And I think what you saw with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the 2008 financial crisis, and the COVID lockdowns is there's been a disillusionment among the American people. So in a way, we are in a healthier position because you now have people willing to challenge that consensus, and they're there. Now, there's problems with that. It's not the ideological, it's not so coherent. It's mostly, and I think you see that in the sort of like conspiracy theorizing online, is like people trying to deal with the crisis of legitimacy without being able to replace it with something healthy. So good news is people are questioning the establishment. Bad news, the alternatives are not yet coherent or clear enough on a wide scale.
If people were to read your work, and maybe, when you have this dissertation published, if there's one or two things maybe that you really want to be known as having contributed to the discussion about World War II, and maybe some of the things that we should rethink, what might those be?
Yes, the most important thing that I want to offer as a scholar is, what are you trying to achieve? Think about the ends. What was it that the war was supposed to do? Start there. Start with that question. What were we trying to achieve? And then ask, did we achieve it? And the other question I would ask is, we need to raise the question of justice explicitly and think it through from the beginning. What is justice? When is it acceptable to kill people? How should we wage war? And I don't say this as someone who's a pacifist. I don't say this as someone who's giving you the answer. What I really want as a scholar, most of all, is to raise the question that we do need to. Revisionism that's just Latin for to look again. And I want to say, in that sense, I am a revisionist. I want to encourage people to look again at the beginning. Think through the foundations of the world order. That's what I want. You're still muted.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think what happens is when we're in this period of like imperial ascendancy, like during the Cold War, right? The Axis powers lost, and Britain lost its empire, and the United States and the Soviet Union basically got to divide up Europe. We had a lot of like hubris and hegemonic patting ourselves on the back, and we were able to look at ourselves as basically the conqueror of history. And because our self-justification was set in religious terms, it was almost like God had blessed us. And so we had forgotten to rethink and to look back at our forefathers and use them as perhaps an opportunity to criticize, paths that we had gone down that were actually very dangerous. And I think that's one of the things that's happening right now, is we're actually bearing the consequences of not having that humility to recognize that the United States, did make mistakes, that FDR may not have been this brilliant president that was, morally above board and had watched out for the well-being of the Western world, but rather as someone that undermined American strength and longevity in the way that he approached foreign policy. And so I think that we also need to rethink our foreign policy. Obviously, 90% of the people listening to this show are on board, America first all the way. They don't really need to disillusion themselves with the regime version of World War II. But I hope that these types of conversations get out there. I hope they percolate out into the mainstream and people realize that we can't approach war and foreign policy in this messianic framework, because all of that does is it leads to more fires that have to be put out down the road. And rather, we should emphasize the well-being and stability of our own order, and that the American people and the American nation come before even concerns of some universalistic moral priority. So maybe if you want to interact with that, and we can wind this down.
Yeah, thank you. I would say it's exactly right. And I would say it's particularly important to recognize the role of Christianity in allowing the progressives to act in the way they did. And I think, to your point, that should be incentive for Christians, especially serious Christians. You should be wary about speaking about what the will of God is. Let me just start there. And that's something, doesn't matter what flavor your Christianity is. Let's start with having some humility when you're claiming to speak for the divine. And when that happens, because it's easy to get sucked into the moral fervor around doing justice, and a lot of Christians and a lot of conservatives, they're animated by justice. I want things to be right. Well, you need to be careful in the way that you pursue justice. And sometimes the most just thing you can do is to do nothing and say, this is not part. It's especially when you're a politician and you're using other people's money. You need to be, what is that money for? And I think if you think of government, and this is very hard-headed and it's crass and liberal bourgeois capitalism, if you just think of the government as a business, what is it supposed to produce? And I would say that's the most important question. I think the government should produce protection and security for me and my family, and preserving my property rights. It doesn't owe anything to anybody else. It's just, they can get their own. Maybe Americans want to go in their own capacity. Okay. But what are we supposed to be doing here? And when you have a hard-headed view of the world, and you are stand back and have some humility in regards to the divine, I think you can think more clearly. And so that's what I really want to encourage your followers to do. And if I could contribute anything, I want people to engage with my work in a serious way. I want them to think that I'll be successful. I have my own view. You can agree or disagree, but if you're going to disagree, you should do it in an intelligent way. And if you agree, you should do it in an intelligent way. And the goal is to publish this dissertation as a book and get it in the hands of ordinary Americans, and to think, and to inspire them to think more clearly about what their government is doing, and about faith too, and about their own lives.
Where can people find your writings, or are you on X and things like that?
Yes, on X, I'm at @JLippincott_. And then I'm also on Substack as Regime Critic. And then I also publish at American Greatness on a pretty regular basis every 2 weeks. But I put a lot of that on my Substack as well. So those are the big places to find me. I'm hoping at some point to publish the dissertation. When I do, if you're subscribed, to my social media, you'll get a chance to see my work and research and engage with it.
Well, I hope everyone follows you. You're a great poster, a great patriot, and you have things that are worth considering. And I hope everyone follows you and pays attention, because rethinking FDR and the 20th century and its foreign policy hegemony, I think, is important for the American people going forward into the 21st century. So with that said, thank you, Josiah, for joining us, and everyone else. We will see you in another week.
Awesome, C.J. Thanks.